Netanyahu's office is being investigated for some disturbing relationships with the Qataris. At the same time, Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet, they have announced the firing of the head of the Shin Bet, Israel's internal security services. All of these things are coming to a head. I want to explain what's actually going on in Israel. But before we get to that, download the free ebook, No Apologies, a collection of articles that I've written since the beginning of the October 7th war. Download that for free. Let's get to the video. The Qatar Gate investigation. The allegations are that a number of Prime Minister Netanyahu's advisors in his office were in regular communication with some lobbyists for Qatar. The Qataris wanted to get more favorable coverage here in Israel, that they wanted to influence Prime Minister Netanyahu so that these people allegedly received funds in order to influence Prime Minister Netanyahu. And this is the scandal that everyone in the country is talking about. But I want to give you some background to this scandal, when it broke, and how it connects to a different scandal that's going on. And we'll understand that what we're really seeing here is the Israeli deep state, as it were, the left-wing controlled deep state, really coming after Prime Minister Netanyahu and coming after his government coalition. The other scandal that everyone in Israel has been talking about for the last few weeks, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced the firing of Ronin Bar. Ronin Bar is the head of what's called the Shin Bet, or the Shabak. English name is the General Security Services. The Shin Bet is kind of like the American FBI, but a little bit different in that it's also charged with a national security role in terms of monitoring all the intelligence coming out of the Palestinian areas. So Ronin Bar was the head of the Shin Bet for the last few years. He was notably head of the Shin Bet on October 7th. Throughout this war, since October 7th, he's also been a key figure on the negotiating team that was involved in all of the hostage negotiations until just a few months ago. And there's always been a lot of tension between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Ronin Bar. Ronin Bar, again, is a figure who's more associated with the left in Israel, even though he's the head of the General Security Services. Prime Minister Netanyahu, as I said, announced a couple weeks ago that he's firing Ronin Bar. Why did he fire Ronin Bar? On February 15th, Ronin Bar was supposed to deliver to Prime Minister Netanyahu a report on the Shin Bet's failures on October 7th. Everyone in Israel's been asking these questions since October 7th happened. How did the intelligence community miss the October 7th attacks? What were the intelligence failures? So this much anticipated report of the Shin Bet's failures on October 7th was supposed to be presented, as I said, on February 15th. On February 15th, Ronin Bar asked Prime Minister Netanyahu for a delay of 12 days till February 27th to present the report. And then on February 27th, Ronin Bar asked Prime Minister Netanyahu for another extension, which Prime Minister Netanyahu granted. But then later that same day, on February 27th, Ronin Bar's office announced that they were investigating Prime Minister's office because of this whole Qatar situation, that his advisors were allegedly receiving money and coming under the influence of the Qataris, and that they had launched this investigation. Now remember, that's the same day that Ronin Bar was supposed to deliver this report, which everyone knew was going to be damning to Ronin Bar and to the Shin Bet because of their egregious failures on October 7th. As a result of this investigation, this Qatar Gate investigation being announced on February 27th, the Supreme Court put out a statement instructing Prime Minister Netanyahu that he is not able to fire the head of the Shin Bet, that they are forbidding him from firing the head of the Shin Bet because of a potential conflict of interest. Because if the Shin Bet is investigating Netanyahu's office for this Qatar situation, then that would be a conflict of interest. It made it look like perhaps Netanyahu was only firing Ronin Bar because of the Qatar Gate situation. Meanwhile, the cabinet, the Israeli government, voted unanimously to fire Ronin Bar. And I should point out that according to Israeli law, the prime minister has the authority to fire the head of the Shin Bet, even without any specific cause, because it's understood that the prime minister, who is the chief officer of the Israeli government, has to have a trusted working relationship with the head of the Shin Bet, because that's so important. It's actually written into the law law that he can fire him. And here the Supreme Court stepped in and said that they are refusing to allow the Prime Minister to fire the head of the Shin Bet. The Attorney General, who also functions as the legal counsel to the Prime Minister's office, put out a statement also saying that Prime Minister Netanyahu cannot fire the head of the Shin Bet, cannot fire Ronin Bar. And not only that, but that if the government decides to challenge the Supreme Court's decision, she will not defend the government. She will not serve as the Prime Minister's counsel for that. And she even put out an injunction forbidding the appointing or even interviewing a successor to the head of the Shin Bet, or even an interim head of the Shin Bet. Again, that's the Attorney General, who's also the legal counsel to the government, telling Prime Minister Netanyahu that he is forbidden from interviewing or appointing a successor to Ronin Bar. Now, you might be wondering, why does she have the ability to do this? Why does the Attorney General have that ability? Why does the Supreme Court have that ability? Just to put this in American terms, this is comparable to the President of the United States announcing that he's firing the head of the FBI, and then the Supreme Court, unprompted by any case, just putting out a statement saying, we forbid you from doing that. Or the Attorney General putting out a statement saying, we forbid you from doing that. Now, why do they even have that power? So all of this goes back to the judicial reform issue. You might remember that before the October 7th war broke out, Israel was embroiled in this political unrest. There were all these left-wing demonstrations. Prime Minister Netanyahu got elected on a platform. One of the main platform issues that he got elected on was judicial reform. And the left wing was having these mass protests, tearing the country apart, opposed to the judicial reform. What is all this judicial reform about? Well, the Israeli Supreme Court, going all the way back to the 1980s, took for itself a lot of powers that a Supreme Court really shouldn't have and doesn't have in other countries. For example, they did away with the whole concept of standing so that any citizen could just bring a case to the Supreme Court if they don't like, let's say, a law that the government passed or a policy. Literally, the Israeli government could make a decision to implement some sort of policy. It could be a policy having to do with even how they're fighting the war. And a citizen or a citizen group could go to the Supreme Court and say, I don't like the government's policy, and challenge it without them being a damaged party. So there's no issue of standing, and the Supreme Court will hear that case, and they've done so many times. Not only that, the Supreme Court started using what they call the reasonableness clause, which is that they can overturn any law or policy or decision by the Israeli government if they deem it unreasonable. And that's where we get into what just happened here with the Supreme Court deciding to block the firing of the head of the Shin Bet. Because again, the Supreme Court has set the precedent with this, and they've essentially arrogated, they've taken for themselves this power over the decades that any government decision, they can step in and veto it. So I know this sounds crazy, but the way the system works in Israel, the Knesset can pass a law or the government can make a decision, a policy decision, and the Supreme Court will just wake up in the morning and say, we don't like that, and cancel the law, cancel the government decision. Now, this power that the Supreme Court has taken for itself undermines democracy very significantly. I don't even know if I have to explain that to you, but the elected branch, the executive branch in Israel and the legislature and the Knesset, which are elected by the people, basically have their hands tied by the decisions made by the Supreme Court. To make matters worse, one of the rules of the Israeli Supreme Court is that the way you get to be a judge on the Supreme Court is that you get appointed by the other judges on the Supreme Court. That's right, you heard me right. The existing judges on the Supreme Court get to choose who is going to be a judge on the Supreme Court. You can see where this is going. So over the decades, the Supreme Court has become a private club of people who all think the same way and essentially have veto power over every government decision. But that's what the judicial reform was mainly about. It was about breaking this oligarchy, this juristocracy, as it started to be called, this tyranny of the courts, to break their power over the elected branch. Going back to our situation, Prime Minister Netanyahu decides to fire Ronin Bar, the head of the Shin Bet, who failed miserably on October 7th. Just one example from the reports that have come out. On October 6th at night, the intelligence services and the Shin Bet, they started noticing that many Hamas operatives in Gaza had activated Israeli SIM cards in their phones. And why would they do that? Well, they would do that because they were planning an invasion. We now know that from what happened the next day. Ronin Bar made a decision not to inform Prime Minister Netanyahu of this and to treat it as a non-event. He believed that Hamas was deterred and that they weren't planning an attack. And he feared that if Prime Minister Netanyahu got wind of this, that he would escalate things, and he didn't want to see an escalation. Well, nice how that worked out. That's just one of the many failures of intelligence, of interpretation of intelligence that the Shin Bet is guilty of on October 7th that came out in this report. The current situation, Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to fire Ronin Bar. The entire cabinet unanimously agrees with him. The Attorney General and the Supreme Court are trying to block Prime Minister Netanyahu from doing so. Now, a word about this Attorney General. The Attorney General is not appointed by the Prime Minister, and that's why this might seem a little strange that there's this antagonistic Attorney General, whereas in the United States, the Attorney General works for the President. The Attorney General is not appointed by the Prime Minister. They serve generally for a 6-year term, regardless of who's in power. In this particular case, this Attorney General, Gali Barav Miara, is a close personal friend, socially, a close personal friend of Ronin Bar, the head of the Shin Bet. Ronin Bar and his wife, and Gali Barav Miara and her husband, frequently go out together. They've gone on vacation together. They're good friends. So the conflict of interest is obvious. Now, what about this Qatar Gate investigation? Well, let's go back to that timeline. On the day that Ronin Bar was supposed to release this report that would be damning, and would lead, in addition to the fact that he did not see eye to eye with Prime Minister Netanyahu on the prosecution of the war and on the hostage negotiations, all amounted to a serious crisis in trust. The entire government coalition wanted to remove Ronin Bar from his position. Prime Minister Netanyahu, on the day that this report was going to be released and would announcing the firing of Ronin Bar in response to it, on that day, Ronin Bar's office releases information about this Qatar Gate investigation going on. Obviously, the reason that the Qatar Gate investigation was announced on February 27th was to try to create the perception of a conflict of interest in the decision to fire Ronin Bar, so that the Supreme Court would then have a pretext to block the firing of Ronin Bar. You see how this works? They wanted to block the firing of Ronin Bar. They released the Qatar Gate investigation, and then they can point to it and say, aha, you have a conflict of interest. You can't fire him. This is the Israeli establishment, the combination of the intelligence service leadership, who are very left-wing, the kind of Israeli deep state, in combination with this judicial autocracy, who are also from the hard left in Israel. These people who are all friends with each other, working together to prevent Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet and his government from removing Ronin Bar from his position. Prime Minister Netanyahu already successfully removed the left-leaning chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, and replaced him with Eyal Zamir, someone who's more in line with the political positions of the current cabinet, of the current elected government. And now Prime Minister Netanyahu is up against this effort to try to block the firing of Ronin Bar. Now, where do things stand? Prime Minister Netanyahu and the government have said that they will defy this order. They will defy the Supreme Court's order not to fire Ronin Bar. They're going to defy the Attorney General. They've also, by the way, unanimously decided in a cabinet meeting to fire the Attorney General for her obvious nefarious activity and conflicts of interest. And where things stand now is the government has full intention of defying this Supreme Court order. Prime Minister Netanyahu has already been interviewing replacements for Ronin Bar and been discussing who that person might be quite publicly. This could lead to finally breaking the judicial autocracy, because all of these arrogated powers that I talked about, how our Supreme Court has too much power that they've basically amassed for themselves, on the face of it, anti-democratic. And we've always known that it would take the government openly defying the courts and refusing to comply with these orders in order to break this stranglehold that the judiciary has on the rest of the Israeli government. So things are still in flux. The story is not over yet, but I wanted to lay it out there so that you have some understanding of what we're dealing with here in Israel. Bottom line is, the left wing has been losing power for decades because the Israeli electorate has shifted very much to the right. That's why we have not had a left-wing prime minister in over 20 years, and we're not going to have one. The only power the left has left is the leadership of some of our government agencies, like the Shin Bet and many of the generals in the army, and the judiciary. So they're using the tools they have to try to handcuff Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government.